So what is the difference between all these different kinds of scales? When you're taught scales on the guitar, typically the first one you're taught is the pentatonic scale, which sounds a little something like this. And probably for a large amount of your life, that's the scale that you're going to use when you're soloing on the guitar or jamming with other friends. You might get a little more sophisticated with the blues scale, which you learn is just a version of pentatonic with one extra note. But the more and more you dig into music theory, the more and more you start hearing about all these different kinds of scales. The Dorian scale versus the Phrygian scale, or the harmonic minor scale versus the diatonic major scale. And you start to get overwhelmed with how many options of scales there are, and also start to wonder, what am I supposed to use each one of these scales for? Well, I want you to think about scales like tools on a tool belt, and you want to use the right tool for the job. And while yes, there are a lot of different scales to learn, they're not as bad as you think, because there's only 12 notes possible in our musical alphabet. So when you stop and think about it, a diatonic scale, which means 7 notes, means 7 notes of those 12 have to be taken up to make a scale. And there's only so many possibilities of ways you can arrange 7 notes within 12, which means that each of these scale differences are oftentimes really, really, really small. It's the difference of one note being shifted down or up to create an entirely new scale. This is good news for you because it means when you're learning new scales, you can relate scales to scales that you've already learned. A good example of this is that blues scale. You just think of it like a pentatonic scale, but you just remember to add this note in the middle of these two. Important for you to learn the major scale, which is one of the most important and popular scales in all of music. You might then absorb this piece of information that if you wanted to play the Lydian scale, you're really just playing the major scale with the 4th note raised by 1 fret, and that's the only difference. You could count 1, 2, 3, 4, and instead of here, you play here, and now suddenly you know a brand new scale. It really is that easy. Then you can just remember to adjust that for other octaves as well. But you hear so often about how you're supposed to use one scale versus the other in some situations. So what you're going to have to do is, as you're learning these scales and the small subtle shifts of notes, you're going to have to give an identity or a purpose to this scale. What does it sound like? What is it good for? What kind of music would you want to play that scale over? And this can take some time and experience with these scales, but I bet you could answer that question with the pentatonic scale because you've been playing it for so long. You know that the typical kinds of music that play the pentatonic scale are rock, blues, and so if you're in a situation where you hear some rock rhythms being presented, and you want to get that classic rock sound, you can go right to that pentatonic scale. Whereas if it starts to get a little bluesier, you know to switch in and add that blue note. The major scale is kind of your classic sounding scale. It sounds like do, re, mi. And it provides a lot of different colors and more note options than the pentatonic scale. If you think about it, the pentatonic is 5 notes and the diatonic is 7, so you literally have more to access. So when you want a more colorful sound and you want a brighter, happier sound, which you get out of that major key, you can switch to that diatonic major scale. And that might be good for something like pop music. Or some of that like 80s hair metal that was really happy for some reason. The natural minor scale, which is really just the major scale starting from a different place, sounds something like this. And when you learn how to play it, you can hear that it's a darker, minor sounding scale. So of course, it's going to work pretty well over minor sounding progressions. And you might learn some variations like the harmonic minor, which is really just natural minor, where the 7th note is again raised by 1 fret. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Which to you might sound a little more exotic. And to me sounds like an even darker version of natural minor. So when I'm playing something that I want to sound really dark, I can use that harmonic minor and pull that out of my toolbox. With the whole tone scale sounding kind of dreamy and ominous, and Phrygian sounding like old school heavy metal, you can start to imagine when and where you'd like to use these scales, and even the way that you play them and the type of effects you have in your guitar are also going to change the way that you hear these scales. Hopefully that answers some questions about what guitar players do on a professional level when they're trying to play to a backing track, improvise, or think about how to play with other people even as they're writing their own song. If you want to hear some of the stuff that I came up with, you can check out my original music, which is on Spotify, and you can find with the link in my profile. Let me know what you guys think of this lesson. Of course, there's a lot more here to learn, and I'm not sitting here teaching you all of the thousands of scales that you could probably put together, but hopefully it's a good overview and answers the question of why you would want a different kind of scale. You can support me on Patreon or find more content on my Instagram and other channels like YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next one.